Good evening and welcome to the Book Show. This is our 10th and final episode in this series anyway, and this week in London there's been a major book award announced, Carol.
Yes, the Samuel Johnson Prize for Non-Fiction, awarded to H is for Hawk by Helen Macdonald. It's a book about her grieving for her father. She trained a hawk. It was in every bookshop in London when I was there in August and has been praised as the most brilliant piece of nature writing.
It's a handsome book, isn't it?
It's a gorgeous cover, isn't it? Very striking. And also Grace Joel, this is from Otago University Press, a New Zealand woman painter who is, I think, not very well known.
No, I have to confess I'd never heard of her until I received this book, but she was born in Dunedin and in her 30s she went and lived in the UK and Paris and didn't return, but there's quite a lot of her artwork in New Zealand.
Gorgeous, and in New Zealand collections, are they? Yeah, gorgeous artwork, and she was very well known in Paris and London. And I just want to mention all the young women who are writing feminist books these days, heaps of them here, Unspeakable Things, Bad Feminist. There's a collection of the most of Nora Ephron, fabulous for Christmas, the late great Nora Ephron, very funny woman. And of course from Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, We Should All Be Feminists. This is the little book taken from her TED talk that has been much viewed, and she's a marvellous writer. So young feminists, a whole new wave.
Kia ora, Witty, and welcome to the Book Show.
G'day, Graham, another gizzy boy here.
A couple of gizzy boys.
A couple of gizzy boys, yes. You know, we don't look any different from when we were school kids back then, but
You're primarily known, of course, as a novelist and a short story writer, but you've also written a number of children's books. You've written libretti, you've done 10 books of non-fiction and so on. Now we've got your memoir of childhood. Can we start this evening by talking about the writing of the memoir and how it differed from your approach and method you used when writing in other genres?
Well, because it's memoir, it's creative non-fiction. So I did a lot of homework, and of course I read Lloyd Jones's memoir, and I read quite a few other people's memoirs, and also Michael King and Janet Frame, and realised I couldn't do anything like they could, which was perfect, was beautiful in terms of language, and was crafted in a very artistic way. So I thought, so what can I do? And I felt that with my Māori background, I should just turn it around on its head and instead write a whakapapa. And so I began by writing Native Son, first of all, and that was going to be a whole traversal of the life from being a young kid at the side of the road in Waituhi, Gisborne, and then going through to about this age, and discovered that the weight of detail was collapsing it all. So then I did decide to create this smaller entity called Māori Boy. But the difference is in terms of the quality of voice, the difference is in terms of the ability to relax, and of course it gives you a really good chance to talk about the people you love, talk about the people you hate, talk about New Zealand. You're able to deal with so many other issues than look straight down the linear framework of fiction.
I mean, you say in the book that you've got a sneaking suspicion that autobiography, biography and memoir must be easier to write for a European than a Maori. Well, what did you mean by that?
Oh, it's because my mother was one of 16, my father was one of 16, my grandmother was one of 17 on my father's side, and on my mother's side she was one of 15. So wherever I was, I was surrounded by all of these people, and I must admit that there came a time in my life when I really wanted to escape them all. So I meant that I don't think that people had these huge extended families in the way that I did, and so therefore they didn't need to be generous and include everyone. But because whakapapa is one of those principles where nobody's left out, I found myself having to write about the history of not just them, but the tribe, and bring in legends and bring in myths and layer it in a more complex tribal way. So I always think of the book as being the writing out of a tribal mind.
Right. And it was an enjoyable experience for you?
Well, when you shorten the book, because in most books, even Portrait of the Artist as a young man by James Joyce. The book is only, childhood is sort of like the first 20 pages
Right.
and then it's over. But with this one,
You've got the whole book.
it's 400 pages of vertical excavation. And so that was difficult. It meant that I had to go not just vertically in terms of family, but vertically in terms of history. But then the great and wonderful thing was that I was then able to write about Gisborne, and I was able to write about a community at a certain time, the 1940s and the 1950s, and therefore incorporate into it not just the life of a Māori boy, but the life of a Gisborne boy who grew up as you did, with all of these different people who were coming into Gisborne. You know, the Dutch people and the Finnish man who used to have drive the big truck down at Gisborne Wharf, and I think that we were fortunate that we lived in those times.
Yes, and the Reverend Evatt, the Dutch minister, Presbyterian minister, who lived just round the corner from us. I think one of his sons was in one of your classes. I think you make a reference to him there. Now, we were
Hans,
yes. We were war babies, I guess we would have been called. And we went to school there, and as young adults, we both moved away. I think we both went to Wellington, actually.
No,
But
you went to Hawke's Bay.
No, Wellington initially, and then
right.
Hawke's Bay. So,
Okay.
so you've got a chapter on Gisborne, the town where two rivers meet, and in which you provide us a snapshot of Gisborne in 1952. This brought back many memories for me. And tell us a little bit about Gisborne back in the 50s and how you see it's changed in the years since, because you still go back very often, don't you?
Well, I do. My sister still owns our family farm at Te Karaka, and another sister still lives in 11 Hague Street, which is still our family home. But in those days, there were only around about 4,000 Māori in Gisborne, and the preponderance of the population was European. So it was a different sort of growing up. It was a place where we were the minority. And for instance, one of the photographs there, the hockey, the boys hockey team, I'm the only Māori in that team. And then in the Te Karaka District High photograph, I'm the only Māori boy in that photograph as well. So the demographic was really, really different. So it kind of like meant that I grew up, my coast rellos used to call me the townie boy, because I was a townie boy, and there was a difference between being a townie Māori boy and a coast Māori boy. But there were so many opportunities. Kiri Te Kanawa, she was born the same year as I was. She's a month younger than I am. And we had so many opportunities. We had the amateur dramatic societies, and our schools always put on Gilbert and Sullivan, and it was a wonderful meld of fantastic culture, and I think that you and I are the beneficiaries of that.
And what about today? How do you see it differing today?
Well, in the book I call it, it looks like a shaggy dog a little bit down on his heels. Some of the shops are no longer there. In fact, when I was writing about that in that chapter, I was thinking of Michael King's history, because I thought to myself, I want to bring a personal Māori and more intimate perspective to one of those small towns that he talks about. And to go back to your other question, I really did love the writing of the book. The only issue was that when you go vertically, and when you're not just dealing with whakapapa but with personal issues, then I had to engage myself with some other issues that had happened to me as a boy.
So this is a memoir of childhood. I guess at some stage we're going to see a memoir of adulthood.
Well, God. We only finished writing. I only finished writing this in June. The last chapter is set in Oseberg in Oslo and in Norway. Is it Oslo in Norway? I've been travelling so fast over the last few months that I've kind of lost track of where I am. Right. But so give me a break.
Yeah,
give me 6 months.
Give me a break.
Give me a break. Give me 6 months.
Do you think that a memoir of adulthood would be more difficult to write than a memoir of childhood, or easier? I mean, it's obviously much more clearer and recent in your mind.
it all depends on your resources. Like with this one, because I was dealing with whakapapa, then that meant that I, could talk to mum and dad and talk to all of my cousins and uncles and aunties. Now, with this one, because I had that career in foreign affairs, I'm having to email and phone everybody around the world saying, did we meet in Trinidad in 1976? And what month was it?
Yes.
So it's going to be more difficult.
More research. The research will be more demanding, I guess. Yeah.
In the memoir, it's always the research.
Yes. You in the acknowledgements at the back of the book, you open by saying, "I want to thank historian Judith Binney, who was one of the inspirations in my life." Could you say something about that?
Yes. Well, Judith was such a generous and magnanimous person when I was trying to be a writer, and she knew at some stage that I would engage with history, and I'm not a historian. I never ever was a historian. It took me 3 years to get, to go through history too, and still I didn't pass it. So she was always a mentor to me, and she was always trying to say to me, in New Zealand, there was so much unresolved history that we get trapped in it. And so she felt that her function, and all writers' functions in New Zealand, was to try to resolve that history. And the more that we write about that history, the more in fact it is becoming resolved, and we're able to see just who we are as a people, a very proud and very honourable people, and then do something about that, so that the mokopuna, and she talked about mokopuna too, so that the mokopuna are not saddled with the guilt of the past and can go on more positively into the future.
Thank you very much for coming in this evening, Whitty, and all the best with the memoir of adulthood.
Kia ora, Gizzy boy.
A lot of the good women writers are producing volumes of short stories at the moment. There's our own Sarah Quigley with Tenderness, a volume of stories. Sarah's a New Zealander who lives in Berlin most of the time but does come home regularly. Wonderful short stories from Sarah Quigley. There's Hilary Mantel, twice winner of the Booker Prize, The Assassination of Margaret Thatcher, a great collection. The title story I loved. It's wickedly funny, biting, a very biting story. It caused an absolute furore, of course, in the British Parliament because the Tories got very upset at the thought, even though it's a completely made-up story, the thought of Margaret Thatcher being assassinated was more than they could cope with. It's Hilary Mantel being quite brilliant. And Margaret Atwood, of course, The Stone Mattress, marvellous, lively cover. She is prolific and has the most brilliant mind, and her stories are absolutely scintillating. And the one I'm going to talk mainly about today is Rose Tremain, The American Lover. Lovely to have another book from Rose Tremain. She writes mainly novels. This is a fascinating collection. The title story, The American Lover, is one of the longer ones. It's sad, 19-year-old girl, American man, much older. You can predict what's going to happen. It's a sad story, but brilliantly written. There were two others in particular that I loved. One called The Housekeeper. Now, she's very clever, Rose Tremain. The Housekeeper is about Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, and Mrs. Danvers. Now, the assumption is that everybody believes that Mrs. Danvers is just a creation, a figment of Daphne du Maurier's imagination. What Rose Tremain does is make her a real person. Everybody believes I'm an invented person, Mrs. Danvers. They say I'm a creation, but I'm a living, breathing woman. And you get the story of what happens at Mandalay, which is called, I think, Mandeville House, from the housekeeper's point of view. And she is not this evil, bitter woman that she appears to be in Daphne du Maurier's novel. She is a living, breathing woman who meets Daphne du Maurier and has a relationship with her. It's fascinating. It's wickedly funny in lots of ways. It's also extremely sad, but so clever to just turn this entire story on its head, a very famous novel, on its head, and give us Mrs. Danvers' point of view. The other one I loved in here was 21st Century Juliet. Again, wonderfully clever. Juliet works for, she's turned 30. She's working for a boss whose nickname is Nursey. Her brother is called Tybalt. She lives at Capel House, not Capulet House. there are Montagues. Rose Tremain uses all the characters out of Romeo and Juliet. The Juliet in this story falls in love with a totally inappropriate Moldavian builder who is an illegal immigrant in Britain. He's a wonderful lover. His name is Romeo. It's incredibly funny, very challenging about social class attitudes in Britain in particular, wickedly funny, and of course ends tragically like the famous Shakespearean story, but is enormous fun. I just love Rose Tremain playing with other people's stories and turning them into something completely different and original. So the wonderful Rose Tremain, a collection of short stories called The American Lover.
The first book I'm talking to you about this evening is Crossan, Clark, Carnahan Architects, a beautiful book edited by Stephen Stratford. This is one of New Zealand's leading architecture practices, highly regarded for its portfolio of award-winning beach cottages, houses, commercial and public buildings. This sumptuous and elegant hardback book, published on Monday of this week, surveys 32 projects built since the early 2000s and encapsulates the wide range of the practice's commissions. With examples such as the multiple award-winning Coromandel hut on sleds, this book contains examples of how one of New Zealand's best-known practices is exploring the relationships being generated between occupants and their surroundings, while still maintaining many of the traditional virtues that attach themselves to the idea of home. The Auckland-based practice partners are Ken Crossan, Paul Clark and Simon Carnahan, and between them they've won dozens of New Zealand Institute of Architects awards. In May 2014, their Hut on Sleds beach cottage on the Coromandel claimed a global gong for the best small house at the prestigious Architizer A+ Awards. Established in 2002, the publishers of this book, the Architectural Publications Trust, is a charitable trust whose remit is to actively publish books about New Zealand architects and architecture that celebrate and inform public knowledge of the profession. To date, they've published 7 titles about different architectural practices, including among others JazzMax, Pete Bosley and Architectus. It seems to me that collectively this series is developing into a hugely valuable record of contemporary architectural practice in New Zealand. Saison, A Year at the French Cafe by Simon Wright, published by Godward at $95. It's not often that one comes across a book quite as beautiful as this. In fact, as a serious collector of cookbooks, I can say that Saison is one of the most beautiful I have ever seen. From the sumptuous linen-covered slipcase to Simon Wright's gorgeously illustrated recipes, with Charlie Smith's stunning photography and Kirsten Roberts' soft, beautiful watercolours, the book is simply a wonderful piece of publishing, and all involved with it should feel very proud indeed. Saison is, of course, the French word for season, and seasonal cooking with fresh products is what Simon Wright is all about. Following the author's heartfelt introduction, in which he talks passionately about his food philosophy, the book is divided into the 4 seasons, each featuring 3 menus. Simon's food philosophy is integral to both the book and the restaurant, and as he himself says, there is no question that to be an individual in this business, your restaurant has to be a reflection of your own personality, thoughts and ideas, and as that changes, so does the restaurant. Saison explores Simon's cooking style, his way of working and his journey as a chef, watching the evolution of cooking techniques and trends, as well as changes in food production. Many recipes are complex, so Simon understands that most people will not try to reproduce all of them. If nothing else, I want you to read this book, he says. Be inspired and take elements from one recipe and piece it together with another. I want you to grow in confidence with your cooking, to taste, feel, understand and develop through trial and error. Following on from Simon's first book, The French Cafe Cookbook, this extraordinary second book showcases his wonderful approach to food and his respect for the seasons in which ingredients are at their peak. Lavishly produced and beautifully illustrated, this handsome book is the next best thing to dinner at the French Cafe. And that's saying something because it was recently voted the 4th best restaurant in the world.
welcome to the book show, Peter
Thank you.
Wells.
Thank you.
You have a great reputation as a novelist, as you've written autobiography and you've written history. This latest book of yours, Journey to a Hanging, struck me as the most extraordinary piece of New Zealand history.
Well, it is a strange, I mean, I call it a voyage into the heart of an antipodean darkness,
Yes.
really, because it takes place at such a sort of crisis point in New Zealand, and New Zealand race relations, really, too.
So the Māori wars, or the land
Yes,
wars, are
yes.
about to break out, aren't
Yes,
they, at the point where this is happening?
yes, that's right.
So
So
things
it's
are-
absolutely at this very sort of strident moment in New Zealand where really everything looked like it was on the point of total collapse in terms of relations between Pākehā and Maoris.
And there were
So-
2 hangings.
Yes, 2 hangings. So
first one of
the first
Faulkner.
one is of an Anglican missionary with the German name of Faulkner in 1865, and that was a kind of a highly symbolic or very sensational hanging. It was the very first time a missionary in New Zealand had been killed by a Maori. Up to that time they were completely tapu, really, and not merely did they hang him, but they cut his head off. And drank his blood, and in a way, primarily the religious Maori religion reverted to a form of behaviour which was current about 30 years before, and of course it was a sensation in a terrible way, and it went all around the world. And
Is it
when-
true that his eyes were eaten? That was the end of
yes,
it, yeah.
yes. And you know, when I reflect on it, and I think it really belongs so far in the past, but one just looks today at IS with beheadings, and you see how the symbolism of beheading someone is so powerful, you know.
Was hanging actually an unusual thing for Maori
Yes,
to do? I mean,
yes,
that's
it
not how
was.
they would normally kill someone,
Yes,
is it?
no, absolutely. It was, and in fact, after that, a statement came out, and they said, "You hang Maori, we hang Pākehā." You know, so
And
it
of
was,
course they did hang Maori, so tell us about the second hanging that's in the
well,
book.
after Faulkner was killed, there was a sort of enormous search for the person who was responsible. Well, actually, a lot of people were responsible, but one person, Kiriopa Te Rau, was identified, rightly or wrongly, as the main person. Eventually, he was hiding in the Ureweras, and the Tūhoe handed him over.
Now, he hid for a very long time.
Yes,
it was about
yes, it was,
7
yes,
years
that's
after,
right,
after
absolutely.
Faulkner was hanged.
Yes,
yeah.
yes, and he was brought to Napier.
And he was handed over.
Yes, yes.
Interesting.
Because the Tūhoe just couldn't cope anymore with military invasions coming in and burning all their crops,
Searching for him,
searching
yeah.
for Te Kooti and for Kiriopa. So he was handed over, brought down to Napier, and they had this sort of huge sort of trial in Napier, and he was found guilty with the jury out for 10 minutes and hanged. So it's about these 2 enormous events in New Zealand, and there is an opinion that the hanging of Kiriopa Te Rau was the symbolic end of the war between Pākehā and Maori as a kind of event.
Right, and he may in fact not have been responsible.
Well, I mean,
he
it may-
probably
yes.
wasn't.
Well,
I got
well,
the impression reading
yes,
your book that he
yeah.
really probably wasn't
Yes,
the
and-
actual individual
No.
responsible for the
Well, you know,
hanging.
in terms of the circularity of history, in April this year, the Crown pardoned Kiriopa Te Rau. So, you know, it's
All
a
this
sort
time
of...
later.
Yes.
Fascinating.
Yes, it is.
So what got you into this? What led you to this story?
Well, a wonderful, wonderful biography by Jessie Munro of Susan O'Bear, Mother O'Bear,
yes.
where she talked about, excuse me, the night before Kiriopa Te Rau was hung or hanged, Mother O'Bear spent the night in his cell.
Yes.
And I thought, my gosh, that's such an extraordinary thing. And the novelist and filmmaker in me kind of came alive, and I kept thinking of time passing and, you know, the drama of it, really. And then I read William Colenso's absolutely impassioned defence of Kiriopa Te Rau.
Now, you've already
Yes.
written a book about
Yes,
Colenso, so you
yes.
knew a lot about
Yes.
Colenso and his connection with this whole situation.
Yes, and I just sort of thought, I admired Colenso so much for this act of intellectual bravery at a time when,
Defending him.
yes, at the time when the whole of Pākehā, New Zealand, seemingly was just baying for his blood, and for someone to step forward and say, no, this is wrong, and these are the reasons for it to be wrong. So I had these two sort of towering people.
Colenso and Mother Abere.
Yeah, and then Kiriopa Te Reo, who himself is an enormous person, with great mana. So it seemed like these, it was just a hugely dramatic situation.
Wasn't it? Yes.
Yes.
It seems to me that what was going on was very convoluted, and there were a lot of
Yes.
misunderstandings.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
Faulkner himself,
Yes.
with his German background,
Yes.
seems to have misunderstood a lot of the non-verbal sort of understood British ways of
Yes,
being,
yes.
particularly as colonisers,
Yes.
and then also misunderstood Maori stuff
Yes.
as well.
I think he was desperately trying to be British, and he misunderstood what that actually might mean. So that at the time of the land wars, all the Anglican missionaries withdrew from their stations and went back to the cities. Well, he didn't. He sent his wife back to Auckland, but then he voyaged out into this heart of darkness.
And he seems to have assumed that he was going to be safe.
Yes, yes. And he was, as all of us as human beings, he was a mixed person of good values and bad values. The good side of him was that he was taking medicine down to Opotiki for Maori people who were suffering terrible influenza and things like that. He was a kind man in many ways, but he walked into the storm of history and became a kind of symbolic character himself.
And didn't perhaps pick up the signals
No,
beforehand that this was
no,
actually a far more dangerous
no,
situation
no,
than he
absolutely,
anticipated.
yes.
Yes. So what do we learn from this then about today? I mean, you've drawn the parallel with what's happening with ISIS and so on.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, as New Zealanders, what do we learn? I mean, you've actually said as a subtitle, the events that set New Zealand race relations back by a century.
Yes.
That's quite a big statement.
Yes, yes. Another historian actually said that it set race relations back so far because it polarised people enormously. It seems such a shocking and event without any rationale. As we've got further away from it, we understand the rationale more. Right. Maori people, as we know, were furious about the loss of their land.
Of course,
and the Anglican Church's role in it was very ambiguous. So their choice of an Anglican minister was almost inevitable in that situation.
Symbolic,
But in terms of other things that we learn, just how complicated the past really was. I think we want to simplify the past into good people and bad people.
Yes.
And the past is very complicated. People behave in all sorts of unexpected ways,
as they do in the present.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Peter, it's an amazing book, and I really appreciate you coming in to talk to us on the book show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that's it, episode 10. It's all over. It's been great fun working together, Carol.
It has, Graham, yes.
We've seen lots of good books and met
Fantastic.
lots of interesting authors.
We have indeed. Now, that's not the end in the sense that the shows are online forever. Just go to Beattie's blog or go to womensbookshop.co.nz and click the link and you can see any of the episodes that you want. So they're there permanently, and we're going to add 5 minutes each, aren't we?
We are. Within the next couple of weeks, we'll be putting up our best reads for Christmas, so you'll be able to see that online as well.
Right, our faves and raves for the year, what you should give as gifts for those difficult people and what you should take to the beach for summer reading. Enjoy your reading.
And Merry Christmas to you all.